Okay, we'll see if I can keep this to a minute, but I feel like the more and more things or videos or articles or just conversations that we have surrounding the police, I think it's important to understand the history of the police and how it impacts today and how it, in a way, continues to repeat its own history. Well, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm for the abolishment of the police. I don't think there's any way possible to have a peaceful armed authority over us, and especially not for marginalized groups, which I'll get into. But for those who don't know, the concept of the police really emerged in the 15th century, and it emerged from the end of feudalism. And for those who are like, what the fuck is feudalism? Like me. Feudalism is essentially, and if you know more about feudalism, you can definitely drop it down in the comments, but from what I gained, it's sort of like this caste system where you have masters and you have laborers, right? And then you have like people in the middle who enforce what the masters need the laborers to do, right? And so what ended up happening is that laborers started to rise up against masters demanding more wages. And just for context, 15th century, this is France, okay? France. So they were demanding more wages and starting to revolt. And in doing so, masters began to lose their power as well. So for a good, relatively chunk of time, people were liberated from the masters to a certain degree because they didn't have as much power anymore. Now, because of that, a lot of the ruling class or the the masters saw that this society was essentially masterless, right? So in order to help with that, this emerged the concept of the police. And the police were there to bring justice and good order and to create a society in which you had masterly men, like, people were being mastered or whatever. And they were there to maintain good order, right? So their main role was to like abolish anything that was disorderly, and this was all under the cloak of we're trying to create a better society, right? It was essentially reform, which I'll get into later why I don't believe in reform. So, while this was their message and this is what everybody thought they were doing, everything that they were executing as good order and disorder was actually what the ruling class believed was order and disorder, right? So they created, like this is orderly, this is disorderly, and basically anything like drinking, gambling, anything that they didn't view as productive, that would benefit, right, the masters or the ruling class was deemed disorderly, right? So they were essentially just recreating the same system they had before, but under the guise that, oh, we're trying to maintain a good, orderly system for y'all, you know? And so it wasn't reform, it was a rebranding of the system that previously existed. And so they basically could make up whatever they decided was orderly and disorderly. And this, and how they did that is that essentially police needed to surveil the people, right? You could count that at least in all your friend groups, all your family groups, there was at least like one spy, like one police officer in there making sure that, the people are encouraging and repeating the teachings of the ruling class and that they're essentially following the rules, right? And they would pay attention to people's love lives, their sex lives, their work lives, and they would try to steer people in certain directions that the ruling class believed was orderly instead of disorderly, right? Whatever that meant to the state, and which usually would benefit the state, not the people. And this would later be in line with the bourgeoisie under capitalism, right? So the police not only were, I mean, enforcing the ruling class, the state, but also the bourgeoisie, right? The people who were wealthy, the people who were rich, right? And it's not as far-fetched as it is today, right? If I'm going to, for example, draw this whole history of the police and this aspect of orderly and disorderly and compare it to now, I think that you'd see that it's not as different. So in order to talk about that, we have to kind of start with how it ended up being a thing in the States, right? So during slavery, you had slave patrols, you had night watches, and what they were to do was to control and conduct social control over slaves, right? So black enslaved people could not meet past a certain time. They couldn't gather in groups. They couldn't walk around without a master. There was a whole bunch of rules, right? It was in order to control black people, essentially. When slavery was abolished, however, during Reconstruction, groups like the KKK formed and a whole bunch of other hateful, anti-black organizations, white supremacist organizations started to come up, right? After Reconstruction was over, policing then began, and everybody from like the Ku Klux Klan, everybody from like all these organizations joined the police force. And hence why you could see a lot of that coming up too in the 1960s. For anyone who has not heard of COINTELPRO, I'm going to do a part 2 because it's already getting long about COINTELPRO and how it connects to today.